All right, today we're jumping into the political history of Brazil. And look, this is a massive story. We're talking 500 years of power, rebellion, and some really profound changes that, believe me, are still shaping the country right now.
So how do you even begin to wrap your head around all that? Well, the most important thing to get is that Brazil's history isn't this straight line of progress. Not at all. It's much more like a constant tug of war, this endless push and pull between big, opposing ideas that have been there right from the start.
Okay, so here's the first major battle. It's this constant fight between a really strong central government, based in Rio or later Brasilia, and the push for more freedom and autonomy from all its huge, diverse regions. It boils down to one question. Who's really in charge? The capital or the states? That question is like the heartbeat of Brazilian history.
And then there's the second tension, which is honestly even more dramatic. It's this wild swing between authoritarian rule and moments of democracy. The best way to picture it is like a giant pendulum. For hundreds of years, Brazil has just swung back and forth between the iron fists of a dictatorship and the open hand of democracy. And that pendulum, that's the key. If you get that, you'll get the rest of this story.
All right, let's dive in and see this pendulum actually swing. We're going to start with the Brazilian Empire, because this is really where it all gets going.
So Brazil breaks away from Portugal in 1822. Awesome, right? But this brand new empire is shaky from day one. It gets hit with all this instability, goes through some super intense regional wars, kind of finds its footing for a while, and then the whole thing comes crashing down in 1889.
Okay, so at the very core of this empire was something called the poder moderador, the moderating power. Get this, the 1824 Constitution literally created a fourth branch of government just for the emperor. It was his ultimate trump card. He could shut down parliament, fire ministers, whatever he wanted. This was the pendulum swinging hard towards centralized authoritarian power.
But you know what happens when you centralize power that much, right? You get a backlash. And that's exactly what happened. As soon as the first emperor left the throne, the country just exploded. This time, called the Regency period, was just full of these brutal civil wars. All these regions were fighting to pull that pendulum right back the other way, towards more freedom.
And this is incredible. It shows how one single decision can just change everything. In 1888, Brazil finally abolished slavery. It was this huge, monumental step forward for human rights. But, and this is a big but, politically, it was a disaster for the monarchy. Why? Because it completely wiped out its support from the powerful, slave-owning elites in the countryside. And without them, the whole empire just fell apart a year later.
Okay, so the empire is gone. Now we're moving into the era of the republics. And if you thought the empire was a wild ride, just wait. The pendulum is about to start swinging even more violently.
So the First Republic, it was a total 180. The pendulum swung completely the other way. Power shifted dramatically away from the central government and into the hands of these powerful state bosses. It got the nickname coffee with milk politics. Why? Because the presidency was basically just traded back and forth between the elites from the big coffee state São Paulo and the big dairy state Minas Gerais.
And then, bam, the pendulum swings back, and this time with a vengeance. In 1930, a revolution brings a guy named Getúlio Vargas to power, and he eventually sets up what he called the Estado Novo, the new state. Let's be clear, this was a full-on dictatorship. Vargas shut down Congress, muzzled the press, and pulled all the power into his own hands. The era of the regional bosses was over.
Okay, so after Vargas is out, Brazil gives democracy another shot. For about 20 years, from 45 to 64, it looked like it might stick. But polarization was getting worse, the economy was a mess, and that instability was just growing. And so, the military stepped in. The 1964 coup kicked off what would become Brazil's longest and darkest period of dictatorship.
And we need to be really clear here. This wasn't just a new government. This was the end of democracy itself. There was this infamous decree in 1968 called AI-5. It basically gave the military regime absolute power. Congress, shut down. Civil rights, gone. And a really brutal wave of repression began. This was the pendulum at its absolute most extreme authoritarian point.
So, after 21 years of military rule, the country was just exhausted. By the 1980s, there was this feeling that something had to change. Brazil made a very conscious, very deliberate decision to try and stop this violent pendulum swing once and for all.
And the beginning of the end for the dictatorship was a movement called Diretas Já, which just means direct elections now. We're talking millions of Brazilians flooding the streets in these huge peaceful protests. Now, they didn't get what they wanted right away, but the movement was so massive, so powerful, that it made the return to democracy unstoppable. And this is what came out of it. The 1988 Constitution. They called it the Citizen Constitution because the whole point was to be an anchor for democracy. It was designed to stop that pendulum. It guaranteed a ton of rights, set up direct elections for everybody, and this is the crucial part. It created really strong, independent institutions like the Supreme Court to act as a check on power. The idea was to prevent those wild historical swings from ever happening again.
But look, for this new democracy to actually work, it needed a stable economy. You can't have a stable country with runaway prices. And that stability finally came in 1994 with something called the Plano Real. It was this economic plan that finally crushed the hyperinflation that had been crippling the country for decades. With a stable economy, that democratic anchor finally had a chance to really take hold.
Okay, so the anchor is in place. But the real question is, how strong is it? How does it hold up under real pressure? Because the 21st century was about to bring a whole series of shocks that would test that 1988 agreement to its absolute limit.
And at first, things were looking great. The first decade of the 2000s, man, it was a time of incredible optimism. Brazil was riding this huge global commodities boom. President Lula's government used that money to expand amazing social programs like Bolsa Familia, which literally lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty. A whole new middle class was born.
But then the cracks started to show. It all began in 2013 with massive protests in the streets. Then the Lava Jato, or car wash, investigation blew the lid off this mind-bogglingly huge corruption scandal. The whole thing spiraled into a deep recession and ended with the incredibly polarizing impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff in 2016. It shook the entire political system to its very core.
And the result of all that turmoil? A country that was split almost perfectly in half. Just look at the 2022 presidential election. It was the tightest race in modern Brazilian history. The difference between the two candidates was less than 2%. We're talking about two completely different visions for the future of Brazil, with the country divided right down the middle.
And that extreme polarization led to the ultimate test of that democratic anchor. On January 8, 2023, just a week after the new president took office, thousands of his opponent's supporters who refused to accept the results, they stormed the Capitol. They invaded Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidential palace. This wasn't just a protest. It was a direct assault on the very institutions that were built back in 1988 to prevent chaos.
And that brings us right back to where we started. The attack on January 8th was put down. The institutions, for now, held. But those deep, deep divisions are still there. So the big question is this. After 500 years of that pendulum swinging back and forth, from one extreme to the other, is the democratic anchor that was built in 1988 strong enough? Can it handle the incredible pressures of today and actually hold the center? The answer to that is going to define everything about Brazil's future.